Welcome everybody. Hello. We'll just wait for everybody to start arriving. It'd be great if you guys can just pop a message in the chat just to say hi, so I know who I'm talking to. There's quite a few of you registered for this webinar, so I hope you guys all get a lot out of it. So we'll just see who's here. Let's have a look and see. Okay. Guys, if you're there, just say hello. Just go to the chat. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got Angela, Karen, Abby, yeah. Plenty of people coming. Hi, guys. Brilliant. Someone from Canterbury. Hello. Hi. Brilliant. Lots of you coming through. Some I know, some are new. Great to meet you all. Fabulous. Okay, so we're going to get started because we've got quite a bit to get through. Now, this is a recorded webinar, so you can go back and watch this again if you need to, if you need it for reference, or you want to just, watch something again. If any of you have any questions or you're not sure what I'm talking about as we go, feel free to just put a comment out there so that, I can make sure you guys understand what I'm talking about. It's not quite the right time to do questions, Q&As about your own dogs. If you want that, then you need to sign up for our next webinar, which is about reactivity in dogs, which is very much associated with territorial barking and behaviours. And then there's a free Q&A webinar after that to help you guys with your own dogs if you want to attend that. And we can get a little bit more specific on your particular cases that you might have with your own dogs. So I'm going to just start going through a little bit about territorial barking and behaviours. The reason I think this is really important to do this as a webinar is I would say on average every week I am seeing multiple people and multiple households, whether that's in-home video consults, where most people are experiencing the same sort of problems with their dogs. And I use the word problems, but they're experiencing behaviours which they feel are inappropriate. So the aim of this webinar is to really help you understand about territorial barking and behaviours, and why they tend to develop, why they evolve, and what they can lead to, and how there can be sort of a breakdown in communication between you and your dogs in this time. I understand that a lot of times owners are kind of just frustrated with the noise or the fact that they can't have visitors and their life is severely reduced socially themselves sometimes by these dogs. So first things first, and I do have notes here, so I will be referring to them just to keep me on track so that I don't get too diverted. But what really can influence these behaviours and what really leads to territorial behaviour? So in a nutshell, vocalization, and when we say territorial behaviour, it's often barking at something or someone, some sort of trigger, is generally a symptom of the dog not feeling safe. Ultimately, it evolves because of that feeling. And I'm going to use that word, a lot, as in how the dog feels. It's something that the dog learns over a period of time, that there is something to be concerned about or worried about or alert about. That in essence as well is a very natural behaviour or dog behaviour. Whilst it's not so natural for us, it is very natural for them to alert and bark. However, it can start to evolve and get almost excessive and be very hard to switch the dogs off. Similarly, it can also become what I call the highlight of the dog's day. So doesn't look like fear, and it could be something where the dog is quite excited about the prospect of barking at something outside. And we'll go into why that is. But ultimately, there's two emotional states that contribute to territorial behaviours, and that is fear and frustration. They're the two leading ones. There are a few others, but essentially they're the core ones that really affect, these sorts of behaviours and how a dog feels. So where do we begin? Whenever I work with dogs with these sorts of behaviours, we look at where they start and what's the background of the dog, where have they come from, those sorts of things. So we can talk about what we call social learning. Now, social learning is important to understand because, in essence, how the dog views the world can be influenced, in very lots of different ways. It's the old nature versus nurture. And there's still a lot of study being done on this. But in essence, we know that from scientific study that there are periods within a dog's development that will likely contribute to how they feel about things in future. The first being obviously, when they're wee puppies. So up to the age of 16 weeks of age, they have a window for socializing. And that social aspect, whilst it may not seem insignificant at that time, because a lot of people can't get their dogs out and about because they're not vaccinated, the dog in that period is being educated about the human world that they're going to face and how that affects them. They often have a fear period between 5 to 6 weeks of age. And in that period, if something or a sound or a noise, startles them and they don't recover from it, it can set a precedent for later on that same feeling of anxiety and fear when they hear it again. It can also be a lack of exposure to those things. So without positive associations with it, if the dog's not heard something before in that socializing period, then it will be deemed as potentially, something new, which means they'll be suspicious of it and potentially nervous of it. Similarly, dogs also have another fear period later on as they enter into adolescence. And we'll come to this, but it's a critical one in the territorial behavior side of things, but we will come to that in a minute. So there are periods of fear in a dog's development. Other social learning can be things like inappropriate socializing. So inappropriate socializing can be that the dog has been put in positions where perhaps their consent hasn't been sought before they are touched or stroked or handled in any way. Now that can come about very much by accident. Commonly we see it at vets where the dogs, are handled by a stranger in the first stages of their life. It can be also a product of people thinking that they're socializing their dog and want the dog to meet lots of people. But inadvertently, they can create a problem by those dogs feeling that they don't have a choice in how they meet those people. And as a small puppy, it's very hard for them to voice how they feel about that unless you're an expert at reading their body language. So sometimes inappropriate socializing, as I call it, is very prevalent in these dogs' early stages of life. It can similarly be, just a too much socializing, which sounds strange, but we can find that some dogs that are over social can get a little bit vocal later on in life and overexcited by stimulus as well. So inappropriate social, lack of socializing is the opposite, where the dog has had very contained life, very limited exposure. So they've not really had the ability to see enough going on beyond perhaps the family unit or the home, or perhaps the kennel and run in which they live, or the section in which they live. We know that the relationships that they form, the bonding with humans when they first come home, can have a major influence in how they feel about people. So how secure is the relationship with the person or the persons that they live with? And same goes for those dogs that they live with. What's the relationship like with the dogs that they live with? They are the greatest influence, all of those, over that dog's life. And if those relationships are not particularly secure, then that can lead to problems with the dog, feeling quite anxious at times. And what do we mean by secure relationships? Well, it's often that I go to a household, a member of the family has wanted a dog and another member of the family didn't really want the dog. And, dogs pick up on those sorts of things. So sometimes that can be insecure. It can also be an insecure relationship if there are inconsistent boundaries and rules in that house. If one member has, certain expectations and another has different expectations. So those can lead to confusion in the dog's mind, which can lead to anxiety and essentially a bit of mistrust around people. We know that dogs that live in multi-dog households will view the world more through the eyes of how a dog sees it. They are greatly influenced by the dog that they live with. Obviously, dogs read other dogs much more successfully than they read us. And so that other dog will have a greater influence in how that dog perceives the world. Now, the classic mistake is lots of people get have a dog, it's perhaps a little unsocial, and then they think, oh, well, we get another dog because that will help them become more social, when in fact it can have the opposite effect, that that younger dog then picks up on the behaviors of that older dog and is even more suspicious of people or things that that other dog is saying are not safe. So we also have to look at things like how much the owners have advocated for that dog. And what do we mean by advocation? We mean, how much have they protected that dog? How much have they stepped in and say, hey, that's not appropriate to do, the dog? Or could you just, give the dog some space? Advocating for a dog is really important, and it makes them feel more secure and safer when things, they're confronted by things. So other social learning we have to think about is the environment in which they were raised versus the environment in which they are going to live in. It's been shown that dogs that are raised in an environment, perhaps like a rural environment or a farm environment, that have experienced the sights, sounds and smells of that sort of environment, aren't generally so prepared for a town environment, particularly with the sounds and the movements of what, chaotic environment there is in town. So adaptability is something, and resilience training is something that can be achieved with the right social program by the breeder. But if they don't do that, then we can find that some of these dogs that are raised in one environment and move to another do tend to struggle. Dogs that are raised in an urban environment and then shifted to a more rural environment can still have some issues, but less so, because there tends to be more natural environments that innately feel good to a dog, and there's more space and generally less triggers around. So the dog has time to desensitize to those things. Sound sensitivity is a key one here as well. We know that some dogs have a predisposition for sensitivity to sound. There are studies right now being done to see, how sound affects different types of dogs and different breeds of dogs. And there's evidence to show that some sounds, for dogs that are selectively bred for very acute hearing, things like, border collies and working breeds, German Shepherd, they can find some sounds, actually quite painful for their hearing, because their hearing is so good compared to ours. So our world of lots of noise and chaos with that noise can be quite distressing to a lot of dogs. We see a lot of dogs pinpointing sounds from the house because, they're aware of them a lot more. The classic one is people say, well, I don't know what you're barking at, there's nothing there. But often, there's something there. The dogs are hearing it, it's just we're not hearing it. It's either beyond our range or our pitch, or beyond our scope for hearing at that distance. But dogs don't bark for no reason. There's always something there. They may smell it as well. They may not hear it, but they may smell it. So as I suggested, breed does influence this to some degree. We can't ignore that selective breeding may have put dogs to be more heightened to territorial behaviours. So, guardian breeds, anything from, types of mountain dogs to, Rotties, Shepherds, are much more likely to develop more territorial behaviours. However, that being said, there are smaller dogs as well who, have a propensity for this type of behaviour too, because, they can be little watchdogs as well. So we know that, breed doesn't dictate this. It can be an influencer, it can be a predisposition to it, and I do advise some people to expect a certain amount depending on the breed type, but it is not something that governs, what a dog learns. It's just what they learn on top of that really influences what happens. So when we're looking at how these sorts of things evolve, we've always got to think about stages of a dog's development. We've talked about puppies and that, early stage of learning when they're very young. But it's really important as well that we recognise there are milestones within our dogs as they develop and age, and this can have a profound effect on how they see the world and how they view the world. So territorial behaviour is something that we see, generally as a dog enters into adolescence. Now, adolescence is something that starts around about 5 to 6 months of age. And it can go all the way through to 18 months to even older than that, depending on the breed type. The bigger the breed, the longer it takes for them to mature. So we know that as dogs enter adolescence, there are genuine physiological changes going on in their body, irrelevant whether they've been spayed or not, or castrated. There are still changes within their brain, and essentially their brain is being rewired. So we see a lot of changes in dogs' behavior when they enter adolescence. And symptoms of that are things where the dogs start to become, more alert, more aware, more heightened, and sometimes more vocal as well. They are essentially working as a part of their brain, which is more the amygdala, which is essentially a function of the brain that is an emotional response to things. The frontal lobes that they normally use, which is more where they're kind of thinking things through, rationalizing things, get sent further back. They're not used quite so prevalently in that teenage phase, and then immediately it comes to its main use. Now that is a survival instinct. It's a period in where they, should they be out in the wild or anything like that, they would need to be able to survive some of those threats. And that part of their reconditioning of their brain is still within our dogs nowadays, even our domestic dogs. So how does this kind of represent itself? Well, a lot of you will see dogs that essentially can, just suddenly bark at something, and you can't do anything with them in that moment. They're just not listening to you. People say that, their ears shut off. I can't do any food. I can't do this. I can't do that. And they are consumed in that moment by that threat. It's not that they're being naughty or they're doing, anything to annoy you. It is they are consumed in that moment, and they're 100% focused on trying to remove whatever it is that is not making them feel safe. Similarly, we also know that during this period of adolescence, that dogs will look for thrill-seeking behaviors. So it's not just always fear-based. Frustration dogs will look for outlets of these types of behaviors. Just like, kids joyriding, teenage kids joyriding a car, some dogs find the thrill of, rushing out and barking incessantly at something quite thrilling and quite exciting. They get a rush of chemicals in that moment, which makes them feel good and empowered. And so they want to do it again, and they want to continue to rehearse that behavior. So it's super important that we understand that there is a genuine physiological change in our dogs in that age group. We also know that other contributors in this age group that affect territorial barking and behavior is how they are managed at home. And that comes down to things like whether the dog has too much freedom too soon in that age group. Essentially, I always say to people, it's like giving, an 11-year-old or child, the car keys to a car and saying, off you go, you can figure it out, I'm sure you'll be all right. They're just not ready mentally to have that sort of level of freedom. Similarly, it can also boil down to a lack of supervision. A lot of people in the early stages of a pup's life are home a lot, want to do the best by the puppy, but by the time they enter adolescence, they go back to their normal routines and back to work. And that means that the dog is just left for longer periods of time without potentially that supervision. A lot of people, I've had to get used to it here in New Zealand, leave their dogs, outside in their yards and in their gardens. And mainly because the weather, might be warm and they don't want to leave the dog inside. It may be to do with house training. It may be to do with avoiding destruction in the home. But certainly there are more dogs here in New Zealand than I've seen in the UK that are left unattended outside whilst people go to work. So that can have an influence. We will come to that, but that can have an influence. And if there's been a lack of education, a lack of input from owners as well, in some skills, how to cope with life, then we know that that can contribute to these types of behaviours too. Similarly, something else we must consider is personality type. We can't personality test dogs. We can't make them, fill in a form, but we can assess dogs through a range of sort of activities to just see how they cope with stresses and how they rebound from those types of things. Certainly, we know that there are dogs that are introverts and extroverts, just like people. And just like people, They respond in a different way to different stimuli and triggers. Introverts have a different social outlook to the extroverts, and that introverted behavior can mean that inadvertently they can be put in a lot of situations that make them feel very uncomfortable. Now, often owners aren't aware of this, and they are repeatedly putting the dog in situations which make the dog feel uncomfortable when they're young. Eventually, those behaviors will voice themselves as the dog enters adolescence. Certainly, we know that dogs are more likely to convey how they feel when they are teenagers. They've got an ounce of confidence to just say, do you know what, I don't like that. And that's when we start to see, the barking evolving. So it's important we look at those personality types. Some dogs, just like people, are quite happy with their own unit. They don't feel that they need lots of other people or lots of other dogs. They're very happy with their social unit, and that type social unit is really all that they want, and they want to sustain that, and they don't need everybody else. So personality type does come into this, and when I'm looking at dogs and assessing dogs, I will look at that personality type and advise owners accordingly as to how to proceed and what their expectations should be in relation to that as well, because a lot of people want the dog to be uber sociable because that's how they are in their life, when the dog is actually not really wanting that as part of their genetic makeup and their personality type. So it's important that we respect those dogs if that is the way that they are. It's something that can't always be changed. An introvert is an introvert, and you can't make them into an extrovert. The other thing we've got to consider is whether we have anything like trauma events when they are young. Now, when I say trauma events, I'm talking about things like, perhaps they had an incident with someone or something that really frightened them and really gave them a major scare. Now, that can be, anything, but if it happens to fall within those fear periods, we know this will exacerbate behaviors of worry around things, of novel things, or suspicion around, new people or new dogs. And we know that these sorts of events can have a catastrophic, ripple effect further down the line. There's this weird expectation that if dogs have had a trauma event, they should just get over it and, move on, which is completely ironic when we think about if that was a human and something serious happened, we would give them a lot of time to recover and decompress and that, and probably give them therapy for it. So, a lot of dogs are just expected to get over stuff and move on. Yes, a lot of dogs can recover and they are robust enough, but there are quite a few that cannot, and they still relive that worry if similar scenarios set themselves, in front of them. So your behavior can have a huge influence in how a dog feels about, somebody coming to the home or somebody around your home or visiting. So it's important that, we are aware of our own behavior and how that can influence how a dog feels about somebody. I call it friend and foe. There's a difference in how we respond to somebody if there's somebody that we know. Our greeting ritual with them is very different to somebody who is not classified as a friend, or could be somebody that we're suspicious of that comes to the front door. I certainly don't greet, the mailman the way I would one of my friends, and the dogs may pick up on that and see how I differ in my behavior towards them. Don't forget, dogs are masters of reading our body language, so they really will pick up on these types of cues. So how we treat people differently can have an influence, and dogs will pick up on those symptoms and those signs. Similarly, we'll come back to that, but we have got to think about how a person's behavior and body language will influence how a dog views them as well. So when we've, looked at how this can evolve, we know that rehearsal is the key thing here. If the dog gets to rehearse the behaviors multiple times, then at some point those behaviors will become reinforcing. The acts themselves can become reinforcing, and the dog will deem that this method is the best method to keep them safe or make them feel good. So it will want to be repeated again. And so where does it become a problem? Well, essentially for most people, it becomes a problem when they can't stop the barking, or it's excessive, or they can't get people to come to the house, or your social life starts to diminish and it has a real effect on you, or it's led to the point where the dog has had to take things further by now, instead of barking, it's now growling or snapping or getting to the point of biting somebody. So what do we need to look at when we're working with these types of dogs? Well, there's two aspects to reducing territorial behavior. One is management and the other is what we call behavior modification. So for most people, management is where we start. If I work with people, I'm looking to see how they can set things up to ensure that there is a prevention of the rehearsal of current behaviors. Now, that may not be convenient for you or your home or how you live, but if you truly want to change behavior, then management is the first step. And if you can't do the management, then you definitely probably won't be able to do the behavior modification. But the management side of things will prevent the behavior from getting worse. It will safeguard your dog and you. It won't let it get worse. It won't get better, but it should not get worse. So management is critical in this. In some cases, it does reduce the behavior on its own, but generally not significantly enough to really change long-term behaviors. Behavior modification is how we change how a dog feels about something. So it's about changing emotional responses. And that's through a process of training small, simple exercises that build confidence in the dog, that build patterns of behavior that make the dog feel good, and that make you feel confident too, that the behaviors are more reliable. So behavior modification takes time. There's no quick, fix for that. It will take time, and if you're going to do it, you need to be committed to doing it on a regular basis. One thing I will add with, territorial behavior is classic mistake is people start to see some improvement, so they relax and they go back to their old habits and don't persist with the systems that they've put in place. And often that will lead to, a regression in behavior change. It can also lead to real conflict in the dog's mind about what's going on and can lead to catastrophic, problems further down the line. So this is generally what I call a lifestyle change for people, and you need to be ready for that, because if you're not willing to change your own behaviors and what you do, then your dog's behaviors will not change. Your behaviors and what you do are intrinsically linked to your dog's behaviors. So it's important that you take accountability for that, and that you are consistent and reliable in what you do for the best outcome for these types of dogs. So when we talk about management, what do we mean? So I'm just going to check before we go on to that. Nobody's got any questions? No, good. Okay, great. So management, let me just check. Hold on, did someone mention anything? No, okay. So management. The key thing here is when I go to home is to, I need to look at the home, the actual physical layout of the home. Your home can have a huge impact on how a dog feels. So New Zealand homes, a lot of them are generally a house centered in the middle of a section, and the dogs, the garden sort of wraps around both sides, and often sometimes, the whole way around the house. Similarly, there's a lot of houses here with big windows that look out, with an open aspect onto the road and things passing by, or may have a viewing, lots of viewing decks from out the back looking over other properties. When I go in, I will always look at the property with fresh eyes. When you live somewhere for a long time, you don't tend to see things. And I'll look at it from a dog's point of view. How would they view this? How safe would they feel in this house? How do I feel in this house? Do I feel comfortable? Are there any areas where I feel like, things could look at you and you could see too much of what's going on that might worry the dogs? So I'll always assess the actual layout of the home. In the process of doing that, I'm looking for places in the home where the dog feels the most safe. It's important that we find out where the dog naturally wants to go to feel safe, or where you may have already decided the dog needs to go for practicality reasons. However, that may not be the right place, but it may be just based on what you've done or what you've experienced already. So the home layout is important. I've been to a lot of homes where they're like a fort, and they look out over other properties, and the dog, can see for miles all the different triggers and everybody coming and going from their different houses. And that can be quite a challenge to work with because there's so many visuals going on. So with that in mind, it's important that we always think about the 3 senses of a dog: sight, sound, and smell. By far the easiest one to reduce is the visuals. So the very first thing we will look at is how can we reduce those visuals for that dog. We don't want them to see those triggers, and we need to make sure that the dog isn't citing those things which tends to set them off into a frenzy of barking. So visual obscuring is really important. And how could we go about doing that? Well, one of my favorite things for doing in a house is to get some stick-on decals to go onto a window. That is just frosting on the glass. Number one area for doing this is by the front door. Classically, a lot of houses here have a front door and then 2 glass panels at either side, or 1 glass panel on one side. The dog has direct visuals of who's going past the house and who's coming to the front door. So that's the very first one I would shut out. I will then look at the house and see where else there are clear visuals towards some of those triggers. And it may not be pretty. You may have paid for a house with a lovely view or backing onto a reserve, but it's important that we're making your dog feel safe. And if you want to change their behavior, it's really important we set it up in the first place so that you're going to be more successful. You will never gain ground and traction all the time those visuals are there, because you're fighting against those being present all the time, particularly visually. So stick-on decals on windows are fabulous. Any windows, that are what I call hot zones, we can, blank those out. I'm sure some of you are aware you may have curtains and blinds. Well, dogs can go around those or under those or through those if necessary. So they're not always sufficient. So the stick-on decals are a really good measure when you're trying to reduce those visual stimulus. Second one is, we think about, apart from the visuals, we think about the smell of something. Well, we can't always switch off a dog's nose. It's important that we're aware that they may have sensory smells from a long way away that we're not in control of. But we can certainly be aware that there are times when the smell of something is going to be more prevalent. Dawn and dusk are the key times for senses of smell, where the air is generally more still. And dogs will be much more inclined to be picking up on smells at that time because dogs are crepuscular. So that means that they are most active dawn and dusk. So they are more heightened at those times. So we know that dogs are much more territorial at those peak times because it does tend to coincide with the times when smell is more prevalent and prey is more prevalent too. It's often a combination of those two. We can use things like baby gates, dog pens, anything like that around the house to segregate areas and prevent dogs from running from areas to areas, which actually reinforces the whole behavior. The thrill of running from a window to another window can really exacerbate this. So baby gates are really important. I always advise it as well as a secondary line of defense. If you've got a dog that's already been aggressive, then you need to have a secondary measure in place if somebody comes through a door. That's just really good protocol to ensure that there's no accidental introductions at the front door where you're most likely to get a serious issue. I would also look at thinking about things like, reducing how much they hear about what's going outside. So we can mask some of those sounds with, certain types of music or having the radio on, things like that, so that the sounds outside are more reduced. I would also look at, the fencing outside. How many visuals are there on the fencing outside? If you've got a balcony, you might need to obscure the balcony. So all of these things are really super important as a first step in reducing some of those rehearsals of behavior, so the dog doesn't get a target in sight, basically. It's super important to understand about supervision too. A lot of people aren't supervising their dogs. So, and what I mean is, passive supervision isn't really supervision. Passive supervision is the dog is coming and going and do what it wants whilst you're at home, but you're busy doing something else. That's not really supervision. So what I always advise people is when you're not 100% supervising, that is, you're not, engaged with the dog, doing something with the dog, then the dog should be confined to an area of your home away from those potential triggers. Now, that could be in your living area with you, but it means that they can't freely go and run outside. You may have a barrier put up on perhaps your sliding doors. I mean, I use a bit of baby pen or, you know, dog pen wedged into my sliding doors so the dogs can't rush outside. There's no free access outside. All of these sorts of things are really important because it gives you a chance, a quicker chance to work with the dog should you need it if something unexpected crops up and they react. Similarly, I advise on keeping some doors closed. They don't need to have the whole house. And, you know, we've just come out of summer where people have their doors open. Nowadays, it's a little bit easier because it's getting cooler and people don't have their doors open all the time. So reactive dog behavior is, you know, there's pros and cons to winter and summer. In summer, we see a lot of it because the dogs are freely outside more, and so there's more chance of them reacting. In winter, we do see some territorial behavior because it gets dark earlier and dogs worry about, you know, shadows and sounds, and their senses are more heightened. So leaving dogs unattended outside is the primary cause for these sorts of issues. A lot of people go off to work and leave their dog unattended outside, often with free reign of that, you know, whole section. I always say that this is likening it to, you know, essentially saying to the dog, now I'm going to leave the property. I tell you what, you look after it all. I'm not going to leave you where all the valuables are. You just need to be outside and patrol it, and you deal with it. Now, the dog does not have any instruction in this situation. They have to work out how to handle this stuff on their own, essentially by trial and error. It then becomes a problem because the dog starts rehearsing these behaviors without your attendance, and actually some of them become really good at it. So then when you want to influence the dog, they're really already in the mindset that I don't need you, I can do this on my own and I know what I'm doing, and they're more likely to take cues by themselves rather from you. So it's important we don't leave dogs unattended outside. If you want to have a dog outdoors because you're worried about them getting, you know, too hot in your home or something like that, then my advice is have a secure kennel and run away from any of those triggers, and it has to be positioned very carefully in your garden. If, however, you are surrounded by triggers around your garden, perhaps there's dogs next door, things like that, or people next door, then you are better leaving the dog inside. And again, we'll talk about, you know, how to go about doing that. So it's important, block fencing, you know, or add fencing, heighten your fencing. These sorts of things are all really good management things. I also advise people to have a system when people come to the home. What they should be doing is they should have a sign up saying about, you know, what to do. What are the protocols when they come to your house? Now, the ideal thing is that everybody is texting you or phoning you or messaging you, you know, 20 minutes before their arrival. This allows you to plan with your dogs what you need to do. And then you can, you know, act accordingly with those dogs and prep them for that. And I will come to how to do that. Secondly, I advise people to put a sign up on their front door. This is more for those unexpected people, perhaps a delivery man, something like that. Now, if you've got people, couriers delivering things, it is advisable for them not to leave a parcel by the front door. I mean, I call it like leaving a bomb. You know, your dog hears them arrive, you know, gets upset that they're there, wants to see them off. They deliver a parcel, a package in their mind, which is suspicious, and then they leave again. And then, of course, the dog thinks that they've removed that person by barking. And then, you know, a couple of days later, they come back again. This is why dogs get an obsession with, you know, the postman or the courier man. My advice for those sorts of scenarios is if you can arrange for deliveries to be sent somewhere else, it is a really good idea. If you've got a dog that's particularly territorial or sensitive to people coming to the home, or set up a secure box somewhere in your garden away from the front door that the person can deliver the goods to and put them in there securely. And then you can get them when you get home from work. We've got a couple of questions. We've got, in a multi-dog household, should you do the same thing for all dogs or try and differentiate? My role, just to give you an idea, guys, we have loads of dogs here. I try and do the same thing unless I have a dog that is particularly well socialized and passive and doesn't really concern. Dogs affect other dogs. We will come to the multi-dog household side of things in a minute. But generally, I try and do a blanket thing because it's just easier on the management side of things. There's also another question: for sound as well as blocking with radio, etc., does it ever help to try and record the triggers and do sort of flooding, or does that just ramp it up even more? Sound desensitization is, something that you can do. You can record the dog, but there is a very particular way of desensitizing a dog to specific sounds. I will come to that a little bit in a moment. But it is really important that you don't overtly flood the dog with those sounds. Flooding is, overtly, putting the sound there too frequently, that it overwhelms the dog and it can become a negative association. So I would be a little bit cautious with that. So back to the management side of things, so putting signs up, asking people as well if they're going to enter the house. I would put a sign up and I would have clear instructions for people, about your dog, and that they are not to look, touch, or speak to the dog. If you just say, please ignore my dog, unfortunately, the word ignore is not descriptive enough. And ignoring can lead to a lot of problems. Human behavior is such that if a dog is barking at you, our immediate instinct is to look at the dog. And actually looking at the dog can create further problems and insecurity in that dog and provoke them further. So we're always looking for, no look, no look, no touch, no speak. Okay, that's our general rules. However, we do have some rules around that front door, which I'll come to in a minute. If you are overly concerned about your dog, and perhaps it's previously had a bite history, then I certainly would be making sure that my dog is muzzled, and perhaps you've had the counsellor involved and that is already something that's been cited upon you, and the dog has to be muzzled out and about or muzzled in the home. If you want to learn about that, we have a couple of free webinars on how to positively train your dog for a muzzle. Feel free to access those on our YouTube channel. Okay, that's All Sorts Dog Training NZ. So the key really management side of this is, the first thing is where do we put the dog so that it is safe? We have to decide on a position or a place for the dog to go where it can safely listen to the person coming into the home. Again, I'm always thinking about sight, sound, and smell. And I want to reduce, some of those sensory triggers for them. The easiest one, again, by far, is the visual. So we know that dogs that are placed somewhere without a visual, and I mean 100% visual, so they may be in a blanketed crate, they may be in another room with the door shut, they tend to do better on an introduction with that person when they finally meet. So that safe place needs to always be away from hot zones. Those hot zones are your front door or gates or areas like that. It could even be a front visual room or window. The singular most important thing, which I see people do wrong, is that when somebody comes to the door, they grab hold of the dog, they hold them by the collar and try and hold the dog back, or they maybe got them on a lead and the dog's going frantic and they're trying to talk to the person at the front door. Now, there's a real problem with that, which is if you want to train a dog for protection, the first thing you want to do is hold them back. If you want to build frustration and fear in a dog, that's how to do it, with a trigger right there. And then if you let go of that collar at any point, two things are going to happen. One is they're going to run towards that person and try and see them off. Second one is if they can't get away from you quick enough, they may retaliate and redirect onto you. And I've had lots of owners where they have been bitten by their own dogs. So the golden rule is you should never be grabbing a dog by a collar, and you should never be holding the dog there whilst there's at the front door. Okay, that's really, really important from a safety point of view. If you need to get the dog to another room and you're like, but they're not listening, I don't know what to do, then you could use what we call a house line, which is attached to the dog whilst they're in the home. So that's something that you can pick up and then guide the dog away. You might use a slip lead or clip a lead on and then move the dog into another room. I might add, though, if you're going to use a slip lead, use a slip lead with a stopper on it so it does not choke the dog, like a martingale type one. Okay. Right. So coming further from that, there's a few questions in the Q&A tab. Oh, where are we? Let's have a look and see if we've got some Q&As. Okay. Somebody's asked, what sort of decals, please? Generally, I go to Bunnings or Mitre 10, and they're just on a roll. It's just a plain, obscured, sticky, you know, opaque kind of pane of stick-on stuff that goes onto the window. You have to clean the window first, and then you can stick it on, but you can cut it to shape and size. They work really well. And that's probably my favorite, is the ones from there. You just buy a big roll and a sheet and then stick them up. I've used them really successfully, and I have a few clients who actually don't want to remove them because now they quite like the privacy themselves and they don't have the neighbours sort of looking at them and things like that. So just go to Mitre 10 or Bunnings. They're absolutely fine, just plain ones. It means as well you can have the light still come in. You're not sitting in the dark. I mean, I meet people where they're like, they've got everything closed, the curtains shut, blinds down, trying to stop everything. And I'm like, gosh, you know, it's not a good way to live, where the decals are still allow the light in but obscure the view. If you really want to get flashy, you could probably put in some tinting on your windows, but I mean, that's quite expensive. You know, these are cheap and easy and replaceable. So we'll come to the behavior modification. So there's management. Remember, management is the primary thing that we do first. It will prevent behaviors from getting worse and escalating. But then we move to, right, how are we going to change how the dog feels about these things? And that is essentially what behavior modification is. It's changing the emotional response to a stimulus or a trigger. There's a couple of things with this, which is dogs require two things: time and distance. Often people are in a real hurry to get dogs used to something because it's inconvenient to them. Or they can't provide a setup that is appropriate for the dog. So inadvertently, the distance is too close to the person, or they haven't had enough time to adjust to them. So the key here is give the dog enough time and distance, and I'll talk about how we do that. And remember, that's all about making the dog feel safer. So before we work on anybody coming to the home or any visitors or anything like that, oh yeah, somebody's mentioned privacy frost. There you go. Yeah, you could do that. So before visitors come to the home, we need to work on creating a system where the dog willingly offers some behaviors. This is without the triggers being present. If you try to train alternative or incompatible behaviors when the trigger is right there, I'm telling you, you will be unsuccessful. It just won't work. You have to build what we call a reinforcement history first, so that the behaviors are more reliable, and then start applying them into those scenarios with those triggers. It's where most people go wrong, and it's where most people question positive reinforcement training where we're using food. A lot of people say to me, well, I've tried food, it didn't work. But the way in which they're using it and the way they're expecting it to work quickly, is just completely unrealistic. So first things first, how do we build a reinforcement history? Well, you need to work out what really motivates your dog. That's the first primary thing. I'll do assessments on dogs, and I'll work out, a range of foods, and I'll categorize those foods from, perhaps their kibble is kind of down the bottom, and then there's a range of other foods which increase in value, and then I'll have one that's like right at the top, super duper type of food that they just love. Okay, so I need to know the value range there. We might have things like, toys. There's a particular range of toys, and how are they valued as well? And we need to work out the value of those and how we use those accordingly. We may have other things. Some dogs are particularly, wanting affection and attention, and they can be part of the process. But in essence, when we're training alternative behaviors or incompatible behaviors, those are behaviors that are different to the behavior they're doing now with a trigger. Then when we're training a new concept, the easiest way to do that and shape that is by using food. Now, when you haven't got a trigger around, you may get away with using a slightly lower value food, and probably their daily food allowance will work for that. When you start working around greater triggers, then you might find you need something slightly higher value. And if it's a serious trigger, then even higher again. The dog will start to rate, about those values. But in essence, we're building a bank for the dog of value, where historically, when you've asked them to do stuff, in their mind, they feel it is in their interest and in their best interests. And that's the best way to start getting those reliable behaviours. So where would I start? The very beginning of what I do with a dog would be to load a marker. Now, a marker is a precursor sound to the delivery of something good. It is something like a clicker you could use. You could use a verbal marker like the word yes, but it needs to be something definitive that is not used generally in your, communication with your dog, in terms of praise and everything else. It needs to be something quite distinctive. It's a moment that you are marking the dog's behavior for getting it right. And it holds the key to your future training, not the food, but that word. The word is what holds the dog and makes them believe there is a guarantee something good is going to follow. Now, we ensure that we always deliver after we've said that marker word. So the dog starts to believe that there is a pattern of reward always coming when they hear that sound. It's reinforcing in itself. And I've seen dogs over time that you just say yes and their whole emotional state lights up. It makes them feel amazing and good. And we can use that when we're building associations with things that they may not like. So loading the marker. One of the simplest exercises I do, I will have food in my hand in a lure. And most dogs have learnt, to sit in front of you because that's where you present their dinner. And all I do is I'll draw the dog towards me a couple of paces, I'll walk backwards, I'll raise my hand above their head, and then generally normally go into an auto sit. I don't have to say sit, my hand action will guide them into that sit. The second their bottom hits the ground, I'll say yes, and then I will pass the food over. Now I will repeat that about 6 times, and then I'll have a little, what I call it an intermission, and I will throw a bit of food one way to the side and tell them to go find it. And just before they eat the food, I'll say yes. And then I'll throw a bit of food the other way, tell them to find it, and then say yes. And they'll eat it. And then I'll start another set of 6. So in total, we have a set of 12. This is something that I would do, a few times throughout the day for a week or so. It's what we call loading the marker, which is just getting the dog to pay attention to that sound, that something great is going to follow. Now, if you do this around dinner times, if you've got set dinner times and you use their food in this process, their general dinner, rather than feeding them out of the bowl, it means it's really reliable because the dog is already excited about, dinner, and they get to do a sort of an activity and engagement and attention with you in this basis, and you're promoting a really good feeling for them in that moment. So that's one of the first exercises that I will start any dog that I train for any type of behavior problem. Second one I will teach is also about hand targeting. I want the dog to know that come to hand, if you touch my hand, I'll tell you yes, and then I'm going to deliver that with a food. Now, hand targeting has a huge number of applications. Ultimately, I want the dog to come and touch the hand, and no matter where I put my hand, the dog should go to it and follow it. This training actually comes from zoos, or target training as it's known. And that's because they're dealing with animals that, that could really hurt people, the staff. Now, they may not use their hands, they may use a stick with a target, ball on the end, but the principle comes from there. Because we're not dealing with wild animals, we can work with our hands, and we just want the dog to target. It's a way of generating willing movement in your dog so that you can guide the dog somewhere that you need to for safety. Again, it requires lots of repetition. So if I'm teaching a dog to hand target, I'll teach it as a separate exercise from loading the marker. And again, I would, when I'm first starting, do at least 12 repetitions. And I'd probably try and do that twice a day for at least a couple of weeks. What you should start to see is no matter where you present your hand, and it should be like the flat of the hand, the dog should actively nose boop your hand and then be excited about the prospect. You're going to say yes, and then you're going to deliver the food. Now, I might add here, there's a little difference in this one. In the first exercise, we have food in the hand, so it's a luring method just for that, loading that marker. In the hand target, we do not have food in our other hand. Otherwise, that can confuse the dog about where they're supposed to go to. Am I supposed to go to the hand with the food or the one without food? And of course, logic says they're going to go to the one with the food in your hand. So in this exercise, food is in a pouch on my back. The dog comes in and touches the hand. I say yes, and then I follow that with the delivery of food. The yes must come first, not whilst I'm putting my hand in the pouch. The yes is the confirmation for the dog that they got it right, and that if they hold on a few seconds, I will go and get the reward for them. Okay, the yes bridges the gap between the behavior we want and the reward that's coming, and it can hold the dog in that position as well if you need to. So hand tugging is really useful. I use it for maneuvering dogs, particularly dogs that are nervous or aggressive, without the need to even put a lead on them, and it creates real willing movement. So if I want to move them to a room or to a bed area, it's a really great thing to teach a dog, and again, it's building that reinforcement history. The other one that I teach is what I call a throwaway or rebound game. That is sending a bit of food out for the dog to go chase. Just before they eat the bit of food, I say yes, and they can decide whether they kind of come into me again or not, or whether I'm going to send them out again. Now, this throwaway technique has applications for when you're bringing visitors and people into your home. In essence, when we're training dogs in behavior modification, our job is to make them feel safer. Now, a lot of dogs that are fearful of people often in the past have shown a lot of what I call flight behaviors. That is avoidance, backing away, shyness, those sorts of things. And then over a period of time where that's not been listened to, they feel they've had no choice, but now have to start going forwards to remove whatever it is that makes them feel uncomfortable. So if we think logically about that, we know that getting a dog to move away from something that they fear, not come towards it, will make them intrinsically feel better and safer. So the throwaway game is a game, a find it game as we call it, which becomes quite exciting for the dog, and it makes them feel good because they can move away from a person. So we'll do that throw out, and the dog can decide how close they want to come to the person before the next throw out. So it's a really good way, and it's a good way of building movement with a person. So as you move, you throw the treat in the opposite direction. Sometimes it's known as treat and retreat as a game, but I just like to incorporate it. I move, I throw in the opposite direction. I move, I throw in the opposite direction. I train that first with the dog. This is not the visitor, because I want the dog to know the game first before we have that potential trigger in place. Okay. On top of this, I always like to crate train or room train or bed train a dog so that they are, going to those spaces on cue. I want them to know that they've got somewhere to go to where they will not have their personal space invaded. Now, you've got to think about that in your house. Where is that going to be most suited? It might be your bedroom, because very few visitors are going to go into your bedroom. It might be a spare bedroom, but it needs to be somewhere where people are not going to go, and it needs to be, not by the front door. So those are really important, where they feel safe. Crate training is something that I teach very early on in dogs, and I want them willingly to go in it and out of the crate. Again, I will use a system with food to get them to go into the crate. So every time they're going in, I'm throwing a bit of food, and then I get them to come out and in and out and in. So in the end, the dog is really excited about going in, and the value is greater in the crate. So in the end, there is more reward for going in. So I'll do multiple feeds in the crate as opposed to coming out. And the dog, you'll find, will want to stay in that crate. And we build that up, but I want it on cue, on your bed. It could be a crate, it could be a bed. But generally with dogs that are nervous, they feel safe in, under something, that's covered, like a den. So it tends to lend itself really well for the anxious dogs. But we want to become in habit and on cue. Again, the best way to do this is do it regularly throughout the day, or use it during meal times. I feed all my dogs in their crates. I barely have to say anything. I left the bowl up and they've all gone to their crates. And there's no point in me saying anything. They're already ready. They've learnt the pattern of behavior. So it's about learning those associations. The other thing that's important here is playing with your dog every day. If you want to build a good relationship with your dog and improve their serotonin and dopamine uptake when they're feeling quite anxious, play is one of the best ways to do that. And that is not self-amusement play, that is play that involves you. So you need to figure out what sort of games your dogs particularly like. Every dog is different. Some like tugs, some like chasing things, lures, all sorts of things, but you need to find out something, because it's an incredibly good way of just building a really strong relationship with your dog on a daily basis, and also a really great way of influencing your dog and giving them really good one-on-one attention, so that they are more likely to think that you're relevant. On top of this, for dogs that maybe have a bite history, it's important that we do muzzle training. And as I mentioned before, you can access how to do that on our other webinars. Secondly, right, we need to move on from that first stage of training. And then the second stage is about the real desensitization side of things. So that one is, the first part is, prepping the dog for reinforcement history. The second part is the desensitization. So there's two parts of behavior modification: desensitization and counter conditioning. So we're going to do a little bit of desensitization side of things. So normally with dogs that are quite vocal in the home, I will look at those triggers and I'll write a list, or we'll write a list together and work out what those triggers are. And we'll rate those from, which is, the biggest trigger to the least trigger. And we start with the least trigger first, and we work on that, and then we build to the biggest trigger. Common one is things like doorbells and door knocking associations. The dog has essentially learnt that those are stranger danger sounds. That's generally because, as an owner of a home, how often do we actually knock our own doors? We don't. So they learn over a period of time that a knock or a doorbell means it's somebody who's not part of the family, and therefore we should be suspicious and alert to that. So instead of having those things as a negative association, we can switch them into something that's positive. And the way to look at that is try and treat it like a dinner bell. So there are ways of doing that, and you can incorporate it, funnily enough, into your throwaway game. So once you've started your throwaway game, you can then go to the front door. You might knock on the door, you might get somebody on the other side to do the doorbell, and then you do your throwaway away from that front door. And that builds a pattern of the dog moving away from that hot zone when they hear that sound. So that's one way of doing it. You may incorporate it into your bed training, which is you hear the doorbell, now that's your cue now to go to your bed or to your crate in readiness for your reward. Again, it will only work if you've done that precursor training without the trigger initially and sufficiently. Any other sounds that the dog is sensitive to, we can change how they feel. One of the classic ones is people's voices. So you could record those on your phone. Someone mentioned about doing a recording. So you could do something like that. If there are sounds that your dog is particularly worried about, we actually have a free sound cloud range of sounds on there that you can access and that you can start desensitizing your dog to. The key is to desensitize them at a volume where they're not reacting, and you start there. Only then do you start to increase the volume over several days so the dog doesn't react. You can pair it with food. So if you want the dog to feel better about the sound, but if you want neutrality to a sound, then it's a very gradual volume increase over several days. So the dog hears it on a consistent basis. Essentially, it becomes white noise. You could also, this is the other sensory side of things, which is add other scents into your home. And when I say scent, I mean, like smelling of somebody else. If you have a quiet home and there aren't many visitors, the smell of somebody else suddenly being present in the home can be really overwhelmingly scary for a dog. So it's advisable to get the scent of other people in there. So if you have visitors or friends at any time, get them to perhaps handle some, tea towels, or get them to handle some of the dog's toys. So there's other smell present in the home. You might even go, I've had a few clients where I'm like, okay, well, we're going to go to a charity shop. We're going to get some clothes that are from other people, and we're going to introduce those into the home, and perhaps you're going to wear them. We have to do a very gradual process of making them aware that the smell of somebody else isn't always a bad thing. Thirdly, we need to make sure that we are selecting the visitors who are going to come to your home absolutely appropriately. So this is really now getting to the more serious side of things, is how do we start to bring visitors into the home and make sure that the dogs are okay. So selection of visitors is really important. There are the right people and the wrong people who are going to help you. And sometimes it's not what you think. There are people who are, love dogs, but their enthusiasm for dogs, or that they know dogs so well, can actually be your biggest issue, which means they may override you or override your knowledge or what you're advising and do what they think is best, or perhaps their ego gets in the way. So it's important that we pick the right people as visitors to help your dog feel more secure about people they don't know. I'm very selective about who gets to meet my dogs, and my dogs are all different with different behaviors. The choice of who comes into my home and who gets to meet my dogs is based on my knowledge of the human's behavior and whether they can follow my instructions. If they're too excitable, or perhaps they can't follow my instructions, they're just not the right people to meet my dogs at this time, or perhaps ever. So, this is a really important sort of thing to do. It, on average, takes about 20 positive, and I mean, when I say positive, good positive interactions with somebody for some dogs to start fully accepting somebody. So somebody who's visited once and then comes back later on, you might be like, but that's so-and-so. It's often not enough for that dog to have a history that that person is categorically safe. It can take a lot of introductions for some dogs. It's important you understand that your dog is trusting you to place them around people who are passive, who in no way, shape or form are going to make them feel really uncomfortable. So overly friendly people are a real issue. People that are intimidating. So that could be that, they're nice people, but perhaps, they're really tall or they're really big or something that, the dog would deem as a little bit offensive. Sometimes some dogs that, discriminate against facial hair. There's all sorts of things. Don't start with those types of people. It's going to be too hard for your dog. Similarly, people that are awkward and scared of dogs are going to convey, some level of nervousness, and that, your dog will pick up on that, and that will make them more anxious too. So you need someone who's really passive, who can be quite neutral, relaxed, not too stiff, but relaxed, who can ignore. And when I say ignore, remember, I mean no look, no touch, no speak. You can follow those instructions, okay? And they will be directed by you in that process. I will add, your dog does not have to meet everybody. When I go do assessments, often I don't even meet the dog if they're truly aggressive. I'm gathering information. The dog can hear me from the other room. It's not appropriate for that dog to meet me at that stage because the owners are not educated enough in that moment. However, I want the dog to realize that I came and I left and nothing seriously bad happened, and that my scent is in that home now for the dog to investigate and start pairing that in their brain that the smell of me didn't mean anything super bad happened. So remember, your dog does not have to meet everybody. If you want a dog to feel good about somebody, if there's particular people that come into your home and you want them to like that person or build a relationship with them, then the best way by far is to use food to pair with that person. But we have to be incredibly careful how we do that. There is some terrible advice out there about how to get dogs to like people using food. And in fact, they may incite more bite scenarios than any other. And that really brings me to the word coercion. Food is often used to entice a dog to come to the person to take the food. Now, if that was a child, the first thing we teach a child is never take candy from a stranger. It seems ironic that that advice is out there for our dogs. And if anything, a dog is being lured towards something that they fear. That categorically is not a safe idea, and it can project the wrong idea and a falsehood into the person being reassured that they're doing the right thing. And then suddenly the dog bites them out of the blue. It's not a good idea, until the dog has really done some great interactions with that person would I start feeding a dog out of my hand. So if we're going to start, pairing food with a person and make them feel better, then that should come from you initially. If I bring somebody in, the dog is away already, the person comes into the home, I will sit them down away from where the dog is resting. And I must add that nobody should ever have to walk past your dog to get into the home. If you really want to build territorial worry, that's how to do it. So they come in and I will have a set place where I'm going to position them. And it's not going to be in a position where when the dog enters into the room, eventually they're confronting the person head on. They may be sitting at a dining table where their hands can be on top of the table, and I'll probably give them a cup of tea. I'll make a cup of tea and I'll talk to them first and chat with them before I bring the dog out. And there's a few reasons for that, which is I want the person to relax. I want to be able to instruct the person without the dog being present so that it's more successful and my instructions are clear. And I want the dog to hear that person in the home and smell them without anything significant happening, without those visuals or without confronting them head on. Some dogs, it may take 20 or so minutes for them to start to calm down. Some dogs, it can take hours. I will judge whether I take the next step for an introduction or not based on that response. If I don't feel the dog is feeling secure enough to bring out, then I won't. I simply won't. I will leave them in the room and we may do introductions like that. If I get the sense that the dog is now settling a little bit more, I may bring that dog, out on lead, but I'll position them in a way where they're not directly reaching that person. And what I'll start to do is do some throwaway exercises with that dog. This is a game the dog knows, and the throwaway will be away from the person, the visitor. This ensures that the dog has a flight response option and can move away from that person. If the dog is barking at someone, don't think that you throwing food is reinforcing that barking. It is not. The dog is in a state of worry and fear at that moment. You are not reinforcing the fear. What you're doing is you're disconnecting the brain at that moment and giving them a job to do, an activity to do, which ultimately in the past they found rewarding. The barking will subside, and you'll find that the more you start doing throwaways, the quicker that barking will start to reduce. I may do a few intros like that, and I will pop the dog away before the person gets up to leave. This is important that I don't build a sense of comfort in the dog only for that to be broken by the person suddenly getting up and moving around the home. That can lead to an explosive response from the dog with barking. That's because the dog is trusting me that this person is predictable. And all of a sudden the person's getting up and moving and that person is no longer predictable. And that can be incredibly unsettling, particularly when the dog may be starting to let their guard down. So if the person needs to leave or perhaps even needs to go to the toilet, I will pop the dog back into their safe room or into their crate, and then that person can move around freely. If we're looking for signs where we can move forward in that training, then the next step would be for that person to start doing some throwaways as well. They can be involved in throwing food away from them, so the dog doesn't, have to come towards them. You might monitor that on lead so that you're safeguarding the dog, but they continue to throw the food away from them. The dog then has a choice about how close they come to that person. If your dog is showing signs of wanting to assess somebody, then that can be, in a way of sniffing. Now, this is where often it's the most dangerous time. A lot of human behavior thinks that when a dog has sniffed someone, that gives them the right to then touch the dog. A dog, when they're sniffing us, is just purely assessing. They're not looking for contact or for touch or anything else. Those are not signals that is compliant with, please interact with me further and be intimate with me. It's an assessment. Even dogs will jump up to assess me sometimes and check my face. They want to see what I have for dinner, but it doesn't mean that they want to be touched. So it's important we really understand the body language of these dogs. Do we have permission to interact further or do we not? If you get it right, the dog, and you do everything right, and your body language is nice and calm and passive, and you take all those steps, often dogs will start to give you some forms of permission for touching. And that can be seen in leaning into you, lying on your feet. They might even nudge your arm or lift your hand up for some sort of affection. However, it's really important in that moment that we only touch the dog in what is a non-conflicting way. That may be under the chin, down the chest, or down the side of their flank of their body. I always avoid putting my hand over the top of their head, because straight away the dog can be cautious about what your intent is when you do that. And historically, hands over the head of them has made them feel uncomfortable in the past. So I need to do things that make them feel comfortable and safe. Similarly, something going over the back of the head and around the neck in the dog world can be, tantamount to something grabbing hold of them. So we don't want them to feel like that. So how you interact is really important. But I might do a slight little touch, and then I'll take a bit of food, and then I'll throw the dog away, throw the food away again for the dog to go chase immediately after that touch. I want the dog to know that they have an option to remove themselves from me in that moment of bravery, because they can feel very brave and then feel unnerved, and it can switch from I want that attention to I'm overwhelmed. Okay, now you need to stop it, and then they can go to bite you. So it's important that we do a little stroke and then we can do a throwaway for the dog. For some dogs, the movement of the hand you have to be a little bit careful with so that you don't frighten them. So, you know, sometimes it's better coming from the owner to throw the food in that moment and get the dog to move away from the person. So these are things that I've learned over the years that are the best tactics. And often I'll go see people and most people are like, I've never seen my dog behave like this. They seem so calm. They seem so relaxed with you. It's not that we're some sort of dog whisperer. It's just we've set everything up right. We can read their body language, and our timing is impeccable, and we're doing things that make the dog feel safer. That way, we build trust very, very quickly, and the dog starts to feel comfortable with us. As I said, though, if I'm seated, that doesn't mean the dog is comfortable with me moving. The next step would be for me to start moving from my seat very slowly. That might just be standing up from the seat. And as I stand up, I'm going to throw a bit of food away for the dog to go chase. And I'll always cue that with a find it cue. I want the dog to learn that find it means I'm just letting you know you can move away from me. And they run for the food. So as I go to stand, I'll throw away, and then I might sit down again, and I might stand, and so forth, before I start actively moving around the room. I want the dog to realize there are predictable patterns, and that movement is the initiation of that game again. Then they start to realize that my movement is the precursor for that feeling of I can go chase something, which is exciting, but also it makes them feel inadvertently very safe because they're moving away from me at that time. And often I'll see dogs start to come in and almost demand from me, can you do it again? Can you move so that I can go chase that food? Which is great because it means they start to feel positively about me. So lastly, I'm just going to come to those of you, if you're getting dog-to-dog territorial behavior, I don't know how many out there have got that issue, but it is also an issue. Just quickly on this, it often starts, you know, with a dog on a neighbouring fence line, or dogs repeatedly passing by a home. There are houses here that don't have fencing, and you know, dogs might come onto your property, toilet on your property, or take an item, you know, of your dog's off the lawn and things like that. These are all things which will make a dog feel really anxious and nervous. Similarly, if a dog's had an incident with other dogs, you know, being attacked by other dogs in the past, we know that they are more likely to be territorial and worried about dogs passing by their home. Remember, if they feel safer from their home to display these behaviours where there's a fence or a barrier, then they're more likely to exacerbate the display. So a couple of things is to reduce territorial behaviours is to increase resources in your home, make sure there's enough access to, you know, places to get water, you know, enough food, toys, that sort of thing. Keep dogs away from hot zones. That's areas where there's known problems on the other side of a fence. You know, it could be that there's a dog directly by that fence, and it may be that you have to have a secondary fence just to, you know, buffer it. Hedging doesn't always work sufficiently. And blocking out is good, certainly helps to some degree. You may need to improve your fencing, and you need to reduce some of those visuals. Secondly to that is we know that walking your dog from home increases territorial behaviour. Essentially, it's a patrol beyond your home, and whilst you know it's your home, the dog doesn't feel like that. The street, the area around you, the block, is a grey area that is owned by multiple dogs that are all, you know, marking and peeing on it and taking ownership of that space. So the more you walk your dog from your home, the more territorial they become. They are already aware of the other dogs in your neighbourhood. They've heard them barking from your home. Now they're getting confirmation exactly where those dogs live when you bypass those properties. And again, if those dogs are outside, left unattended, they're racing at fences, that's pure intimidation to your dog, which can make them feel even worse about other dogs. So my advice is avoid walking from your home if at all possible. Go in the car, go to a reserve, go somewhere more natural for the dog to investigate, and then go home. Try and avoid street walking if you can. It's very stressful for these sorts of dogs, and it can make things worse. We want to prevent that fence running, so that may mean you need to install new fencing, prevent them running from side to side on the house. I see that a lot, dog running from one side to the other. Same with, you know, when there's eye hopping for people. And again, just like, you know, we've said before, no access outside unless there's 100% supervision to reduce the rehearsal, and so that you can increase your influence over them. And perhaps come to an agreement with a neighbour. If they've got a neighbouring dog, you might come to a decision about a timetable, because the behaviour is not good for either of you or your dogs. About, come to a timetable where you let the dogs out, and each other's going to let the dogs out to avoid problems, or perhaps text each other, just letting each other know that you're going to let the dog out. If you really want to try and get those dogs to be compatible, then the best way to do it is for those dogs to meet on neutral ground, and start building a relationship that way. But if the relationship is so negative, it can be tricky to do, and I would advise you to get support from a professional to do that. So for both territorial behaviours towards people and territorial behaviour towards dogs, we need to think about, if it's a frustration-based behaviour, if the running out and running at things and barking at things has become the highlight of their day, it begs the question whether they're getting enough stimulation throughout the day elsewhere. And that doesn't always mean physical stimulation, it might just be mental stimulation. They're looking for a job. The classic thing I always say to people is humans are terrible as territory managers. We tend to stand there and let them bark, and we tell them to shut up because it's not important to us. However, if somebody kept poking their head over the fence and peering into our home and our dog alert, we probably pay more attention to it. So we ourselves can become desensitized to these sorts of behaviors and get, irritable about the noise that our dogs make. But remember, they're doing it because they are concerned and they need your assistance and your help. The more you don't assist and help, the more they're going to continue barking, because it's frustrating for them that you're not paying attention to something that they deem as important. So increase their mental stimulation, and if you need to, increase their physical stimulation as well. If you want some ideas on that, we have a whole range of videos on our Facebook page for canine enrichment and 50 ways to feed your dog. Those might help you, work out what to do. If you've had a busy day, they're a real go-to for helping reduce your dog's, frustration levels. It's also great for interaction with you and building that positive reinforcement history. Be aware that these behaviours that are evolving at home and rehearsing at home will eventually generalize beyond the home. This is the rehearsal. This is the dress rehearsal for when they meet something outside. So if they go out and about, don't be surprised that at some point they're going to show some sort of reaction to a stranger walking down the street or a dog walking down the street. And it may be a dog that they've heard in the neighborhood that sounds offensive, or the one that's been peeing on your lawn, and they come across it and then there's an incident. It often starts at home and then evolves out and about. It's because if they're practicing this 10, 20 times a day, it's where they're getting the greatest learning from. So we must reduce home environment practice to conquer them feeling better when they're out and about. Be empathetic. I know it's hard and it can be frustrating when they're barking lots. And it's very easy to think, I've just had enough of this, I'm going to shout at the dog, and find other ways that you're trying to deal with it. Ultimately, you need to understand that the dog is not feeling safe the majority of the time, and it's our job to make them feel safer. If you're not proactive, if you're reactive, then the behavior is going to start to continue. So if you want to see real change, you have to change what you're doing. It may not be convenient at the beginning. Don't fix on that. Small changes to your management systems and some of these other behavior modification systems, long term, you'll get long term results and things will start to get better and relax. I must just talk about aversives. What do I mean by aversives? These are systems that have been designed to stop, barking behaviors, aggression towards people or other dogs. Aversives is using really a positive punishment system. That is that when a dog shows a response to something negatively occurs to try and interrupt that behavior or stop that behavior. These can include things like anything from a human shouting or using intimidation or threats towards a dog. This can use, something as simple as water bottles to stop barking. Rolled up newspapers is a classic one. I'm going to, slap it on the side or, threaten the dog with it. Obviously, moving on from that, we have, things like sound deterrents. So there's buttons that you press that have a high-pitched sound that it's supposed to interrupt the dog's barking. There are pet correctors, which is a air compressor, citronella, collars, bark collars, e-collars, and fencing containment systems. All of these things use something that emotionally stunts the dog. It suppresses the behavior of the dog so they can no longer convey how they're feeling. So a lot of people say that the dog's behavior has got better, when in fact what's all that's happened is the dog's behavior has been suppressed. The dog can no longer convey how they feel. I would much rather have a dog tell me how they feel so that I can help them than feel that they can't trust me to tell me how they're feeling at all, for fear of that consequence, and it's an immediate consequence in that moment. In my experience, all of those things make their anxiety worse, their fear worse. If they get a shock at the absolute moment they hear that sound or that person appears or something that worries them, all you're doing is building a more negative association with that thing. So my advice is, please don't use it. It may seem like a short-term fix, but the long-term damage, is quite significant. And I spend my time with a lot of clients trying to undo what has happened with those systems. If you want long-term results and long-term behavior change, then you need to invest in the time and the consistency and the reinforcement history with your dogs on these alternative types of behavior. So just to summarize, guys, because we've gone over time a little bit, there are no quick fixes for these types of behavior. If the dog has learned these things over a period of time, obviously it suggests that it's going to take time to unravel these types of behaviors. However, I know that with a lot of my clients, if they are really consistent and they do, everything right, and they really work hard, over periods of weeks and months, they can see really significant improvement in their dog's behaviors. Ones that make the life of the dog and the life of their family, so much better, that they feel encouraged now to carry on. A lot of the clients I work with are at the point maybe sometimes that they don't want to continue with the dog, they want to rehome the dog, or perhaps even, we've talked about euthanasia with those dogs if it's no longer safe. In essence, I always talk to those owners and say, what have we tried so far? And by far, most common thing I see is that there's not been a proper program in place to help those dogs. You may also want to get the assistance from a veterinary behaviourist. It's always important with behaviour changes in dogs that we assess that they don't have any pain or underlying medical issues. The dog may look fine on the surface, but it's not, I'm not a vet. I will still get them assessed, blood tests done to make sure there's not something underlying. In my experience, there can be. I've had it, so this is why I caution you. It got missed by the previous owners, and there was an underlying issue with this dog that was creating more of these types of behaviours. And the last thing is, progression is never linear. We have our goals. This is what I would like. Be realistic in your expectations. What you may want and what you may achieve are two different things. Let go of your ideals. Be prepared that progression is up and down. You will have really good days and then some bad days, and it will go up and down. But overall, your progression will keep going up. And that's what you need to hold on to. It's really hard to get consumed by those bad events and what goes on. But just remember, as humans, we're terrible at this and remembering the good stuff and always fixating on the bad stuff. It's important to make sure you're aware of that progression and perhaps note it and mention it in a diary so that you can look back on it and just see, well, actually, hang on, we had like 4 or 5 days that was really good. And then we just had one blip where it went really wrong. From where you were, that may be a really good progression to begin with. But just please bear in mind, it takes time to work with these dogs and a lot of understanding. But if you have the commitment and the will and the consistency to do it, you will see results. And if you're not getting the progression, then something in your behavior plan needs to change. So if you're ever unsure, you need to just seek the advice of a professional, a veterinary behaviorist, a behavior consultant or advisor like us, so that we can help you further or perhaps adapt what you're doing and change to fit your scenario. But ultimately, it's down to you guys to make those changes and make that commitment. It has to become a habit. And we know how hard habits are to break. as well as how hard they are to form. But if you get into the habit and it becomes the norm and things become more predictable for your dog, you will see better results. Okay, guys, we're going to leave it there. It's been great to speak with all of you. I hope that's been really helpful for a lot of you. If any of you need any more support or further advice, obviously you're welcome to come onto our next webinar, which is reactivity in dogs, because obviously these guys are sort of intrinsically linked. And if you do both of those webinars, you will be able to access our free Q&A webinar after that, where you'll be able to ask some questions about your dogs and perhaps some case studies that we've done, so you can see how we resolve things and work through things and improve things. But essentially, guys, if you want any more support going on from here, we do video consults too if you're not local and you want some more direct advice or help at any stage. It's amazing how much we can do online now to support people. But obviously in home, we can do it as well. So just get in touch. Thanks for watching, guys, and I wish you all well with your dogs and hope that this has given you a few guidelines of how you can start to change your dog's behavior. Take care, everyone. Bye.